Hello, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. Rachel Swarns is a contributing writer for the New York Times and professor at NYU. She's written several books. One was American Tapestry, the story of the Black, white, and multiracial ancestors of Michelle Obama. Her latest book, The 272, the families who were enslaved and sold to build the American Catholic Church. She reveals the history of the Catholic Church and certainly opens the door for a conversation like the one we're about to have today. Thank you, Rachel, so much.
Oh, thanks for having me.
For being here. I've enjoyed your work in the New York Times for many years and your book about Michelle. This book is an incredible, you're such a good, as I was telling you before, storyteller. Because in order to tell the stories of the good guys, you know, the enslaved, I think, you know, the victims, and the bad guys, so that you really got a sense of their personalities, you know, it's really an extraordinary feat.
Thank you, thank you. You know, when you're writing about slavery, you know, I'm always aware that there are folks who are immediately going to say, stop, no thank you, not interested. And so how do you tell a narrative? How do you bring a narrative to folks? And I felt like focusing on a family was the way to do it, the way to bring people in.
Now, this story came to you by coincidence in a way,
yes.
You know. Tell us about that.
Yes. It really emerged, as stories do sometimes, kind of serendipitously. I was a reporter at the New York Times, and a colleague of mine, a business reporter, got a tip from a Georgetown alum who was pitching her on a story about an 1838 slave sale that benefited Georgetown. And he wanted to offer the New York Times an exclusive. And you know, my colleague was intrigued but uncertain, like, was this even a story? And it's my great fortune that she didn't delete the email. She remembered my book about Michelle Obama's enslaved ancestors and said, oh, she'll know if this is a story. And I knew immediately it was a story.
Well, and I love the way you start the book by a present day encounter of a person sitting in an office at Georgetown getting a phone call.
Yes, I mean, it was amazing. This is a guy by the name of Jeremy Alexander, who's an employee at Georgetown, who watched kind of what happened. My first story ran in the New York Times. All of these people learned of their history and their ties to this sale. All these descendants emerge. He's watching all of this happening. How interesting. He's a black guy who's Catholic. And then he gets a phone call from someone he's connected to on Ancestry.com who says, you know, I think it's this Georgetown thing. And he's like, do you know where I am right now? Now? Yeah.
Sitting in an office, and it turns out that he was a descendant.
That's right. Had no idea.
Of the very
Had never
sale.
Heard of priests enslaving people, a devout Catholic.
Oh, well, I mean, that's the story that is just, you know, so you ran it first as an article and then turned it into a book. 7 years in the making of the research is just incredible. You know, you refer often to the fact that the records are missing, the records are lost, but what surprised me was how much is actually left and what you were able to put together as a story about how all of this happened. So from the very first arrival of, which is also an interesting story that people don't know about, of the Jesuits from Britain arriving on these shores. Take us from that point on.
Right. So this story, you know, which stunned me as a black woman, as a Catholic woman, about Catholic priests and slaveholding. What? You know, the Jesuits arrive in Maryland, British colony, which was established in part as a refuge for the Catholic Church. And initially, they, like others, rely on indentured servants. And then that transitions to a slave economy. And the story of this family starts with the matriarch, a black woman by the name of Anne Joyce, who arrives in the late 1600s as an indentured servant.
A free woman.
A free woman who has a contract. She's going to work for, you know, a term of years, 3 to 5 years, and be on her way. But that's not what happens. She arrives at this moment where this transition is taking place. Her contract is burned. She's forced into slavery by prominent Catholics, and she loses everything. The one thing she has and the one thing she keeps and holds on to is her story. And she tells that to anyone who would listen. Our liberty was stolen and we should be free people. She tells that to the white people around her and her descendants. And her descendants resist. She has descendants who kill an overseer and are executed. She has descendants who take the Jesuits to court, file lawsuits to try and get their freedom. Only a few gain their freedom that way. She has a descendant by the name of Harry Mahoney, who during the War of 1812 saves the church's wealth.
Buried it, ran
That's
off into
right. Into the woods.
Buried it, saved
right.
the church.
And wins a promise from the priests that neither he nor his family will ever be sold. And that promise is broken in 1838 when the Jesuits sell 272 men, women, and children to save Georgetown.
So, first of all, as you say, it's a shock to know that the priests were in the slave trade and
Yes.
using slaves to build their wealth and build Georgetown University, ultimately, that this was the way they did it. And the broken promises, there are two things that run through it. Anne Joyce's story that keeps getting told, and the promises that keep getting broken
over
and over again, generation after generation.
And it's important to know that, slavery was foundational to the Catholic Church. Priests who relied on slavery and slave sales built the nation's first archdiocese, the nation's first cathedral, first Catholic institution of higher learning, Georgetown. Priests who operated a plantation and sold people established the first Catholic seminary. We don't know, when the traditional story of the emergence of the Catholic Church leaves out the enslaved. We don't know, as Americans, we don't know that history, but it is pivotal.
Interesting that, too, another piece that you reveal is the difference between the enslaved and the indigenous populations via the Jesuits in Rome and all who felt the indigenous were salvageable.
Worthy of,
and the slaves were not. So
Right.
that you could enslave blacks, but not the indigenous population. I mean, which, it sort of counter to what we know about the way the indigenous people generally were treated in this country when.
Right. I mean, Rome made a decision, and there were priests who advocated for indigenous people in the Americas, who were enslaved also initially, saying no, they shouldn't be enslaved. But Rome was silent about the enslavement of black people and African people for a long time. Now, the priests believed that the enslaved had souls, though, right? So it's this crazy contradiction. They believed that enslaved people had souls and needed to be tended, and that they had an obligation to tend those souls. At the same time, though, the buying and selling of their bodies was permissible.
So let's go to 1838, the big sale. Now, this is after promises have been made that the Mahoney family would not be broken up.
That's right.
And
what happens is that, Georgetown and the Maryland province, which is kind of the Jesuits, part of the Jesuits' organizational structure, the main province in the United States, were struggling financially. And in 1838, when hard times hit, the Jesuits did what a lot of people did, which was to sell off these people. And the goal was not only to stabilize Georgetown, to save Georgetown, to stabilize the Jesuits in Maryland, but also, to build a constellation of Jesuit institutions. And they felt like they needed the money to do that. And that was paramount. And they were successful. Georgetown survived. So did the Jesuits, who became known as a teaching order with colleges around the country. But these families were torn apart and forgotten for more than a century.
so tell us about the divergent lives then that the families lived, depending upon where they were sent. I was talking with you a bit earlier about another thing that I just had never paid that much attention to, because I don't think anybody really has yet, at least until your book, talked about the vast movement of slaves, like 1 million people from the north to the south, having devastated the lands in the north and now moved to Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, those places, but millions of people.
So this was, as some historians have observed, this kind of story that I'm writing about is a microcosm of what was happening in the country at the time, which was, just as you said, in the Chesapeake, in the mid-Atlantic, you had depleted land, and you had this booming plantation sector of cotton, sugarcane in the Deep South. And, selling people south became, the thing that happened. And there was this vast movement of enslaved people from the mid-Atlantic to the south. And the Mahoney families, the Mahoney family, among many families, was among those split up in that. I talk about two sisters, Anna and Louisa. These are Harry Mahoney's daughters. Louisa is encouraged by a priest to run, because it's important to know that there were priests all along the way who raised questions and concerns and protested this enslavement of people. So she runs and escapes from the slave traders. Her sister, with 2 young children, doesn't, and the family is split apart.
And so from that, where do you trace their descendants? In 2023, that's a big leap because we're talking 1838. That's right. But Anne Joyce and the Mahoney story,
yes,
lives.
It lives. And actually, so I wrote a story, the first story that I wrote about this history, about this sale, about Georgetown reckoning with it. There were only about a handful of descendants that had been identified at that point, and we knew that there were more. And so we did a kind of call out saying, hey, here's the passenger list of the ship that carried many people. It actually had full names, which is rare for the enslaved, first and last. Are you connected to this history? Scores of people wrote back to us. And Melissa Kemp, who had known the history from Anne Joyce, she's Louisa's family, the family that stayed. She knew about Louisa and the family's long history with the Jesuits, but had never heard about the sale. And when she read the article, she said, wait, is this connected to us too? And of course it was. And she was the one who then reached out to Jeremy, who happened to be Anna's descendant. And the families, for the first time, were reunited.
So the family that ran away and the family that was trapped in slavery, yes, finally, so that happened recently.
Right, that happened in 2016, yeah, so just 7 years ago. And it's important to know that while the priest who ran the plantation where the Mahoneys were enslaved encouraged Louisa to run, she did escape being shipped off. But, and again, these priests are complicated, she comes back, ships have sailed, and she's welcomed back into slavery, where she remains until after the Civil War. And there was this idea among, some progressives, if that's a term we can use among these priests, yeah, that selling people was wrong, but enslaving them, not so much.
Because I guess it's somewhat of the story that's trying to be told now, that there are benefits to being
right. There was this paternalistic idea that we will guide them, we will train them, and the priest who ran that plantation, who was a very forward-thinking man for his time, that may have been the kind of view that he held.
Well, you do such a wonderful job in telling the stories of all of these, people. Maluddy, who, it's interesting how much these people went to Rome, came back, back and forth. Another piece of history, yeah, that we're not quite aware of how much of a relationship that there was back and forth like that. And he comes back, and everybody thinks that he's going to be a savior, in a sense, smart, running Georgetown, saving Georgetown, but just the opposite. But the way you tell his story,
Yeah, these priests were interesting, and the priests who orchestrated this mass sale were, this new generation of American-born Jesuits who were trained in Rome and were, people thought destined to kind of lead the province to greatness. And Thomas Milady, who was early president of Georgetown, a leader of the Jesuits, was in many ways like what you might think you would need: ambitious, charismatic. He had his character flaws. He was also, he drank a lot, right? They talk about it. And it was impetuous and brash. But he was also a visionary. He saw that the Catholic Church, established in this rural plantation kind of setting, wasn't the future. He looked north and said, look, waves of immigrants from Ireland are pouring into our cities. That's where the church is headed. It's not this rural plantation economy. It's in the cities, and we need to be positioned to take advantage of that. But he was willing to do it at the cost of these families, even in violation of,
the promises,
promises, and what Rome had said. You had to keep these families together if you were going to sell them.
Right. Well, he wound up getting into major trouble with.
That's exactly right. He was exiled, but he was rehabilitated too. Well, it's not a simple story.
And what I want to know, Rachel, is how do you know all of this? Where was all of this research done, and how did you find these stories?
So, the story of Jesuit slaveholding has been known to historians, but not to the wider public. And so when I first started writing about this for the New York Times, I really wanted to know more about these families and more about these priests. And the Jesuits were great record keepers. And so there is a treasure trove of records. Now, they write about the enslaved in passing and in fragments. So often you are kind of weaving together just these threads of information. And I traveled to archives and courthouses around the country, relied on archives from Ireland and Rome as well, trying to piece together the story of the enslaved and about how the Catholic Church grew up in America, which is a story we just haven't known in its fullness.
You've done a terrific job. I mean, it's like the thriller, I mean, we all know the ultimate outcome, but getting there is quite fascinating. So bring us up to date in the reaction to the Catholic Church, the Jesuits, Georgetown, to all of this reckoning that has to take place.
That's right. So Georgetown and the Jesuits have taken a number of steps. Both institutions have apologized for their history. Georgetown has offered preference in admissions to the descendants of the enslaved, legacy status in effect. They've created what they describe as a reconciliation fund. They are raising $400,000 a year to benefit programs for descendant communities. The Jesuits partnered with a group of descendants to create a foundation. And they've promised to raise $100 million to benefit racial reconciliation projects and projects to benefit descendants. It's the largest effort by the Roman Catholic Church to address its history. At the same time, they've had trouble raising that money. And some descendants honestly feel like, why are you raising money? Shouldn't the church just be, giving this money? So there are lots of questions and concerns among descendants, even as they acknowledge the change. And one of the most important things, the most unexpected things that I've seen is among the descendants themselves. When I was first writing, there are a handful of descendants identified, now more than 6,000, and they are in the business of repairing what was torn apart, reuniting those families. Just Labor Day weekend, they were together learning about each other's histories, sharing memories, getting to know each other again. It's been incredibly meaningful to see that happen.
That is, and thank you so much for your part in all of that. I doubt that had the story not been told so well and convincingly, that we might not be at this point now. And usually when you think of this wave of renaming of buildings throughout the country, you know, because they were enslavers, terrible, horrible people, it takes more than taking a person's name off of a building, and I guess that was one of the first things that happened at
That's right.
Georgetown.
Yep, one of the things they did there as well. Yeah.
Right, right. Oh, incredible. Well, another piece of your work that you've done at the New York Times that I love is that you were in charge of making sure that how many stories were there about Black people that had not been printed in the New York Times?
So, yeah, it was such a great project. One of my colleagues, a photo editor, in 2016, was thinking about, you know, Black history and could we do something interesting with our archives? And she said, you know what about looking at what didn't get published? And she went down into our archives, which we call the morgue,
Right.
and was astounded at what she started to find, and reached out to me and to others, and we created a project we called Unpublished Black History, which became a book called Unseen. And it really was an examination of, one, beautiful images, but also the role that newspapers and media have played in marginalizing African Americans in this country. We showed these images that hadn't been published and asked why.
Well, and how did that work out within the institution itself? What's the outcome? I always wondered, suddenly all of these stories of the New York Times buried for year after year after year are being seen and appreciated. What were they saying?
Part of, I think, a larger reckoning among newspapers around the country. It's not just the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the LA Times, Seattle Times. I've been looking back and saying, at this moment, when we are wrestling with the history of race, and not just the history, but just what is going on now, right? And we look at police brutality, the killing of Black men and women. How did we get here? And we are not, as media, you know, isolated from this. So it was part of this reckoning, and I think that inside the paper, at least part of this project, there was a keen awareness that this was something that needed to happen.
I was just reading the reissue of the Kerner Report, which was was it 1977 or so that it was published, and talking about the media, where women and people of color were described as window dressing on the set. And from your perspective of having still a very pronounced, powerful position in the news media, still window dressing on the set in terms of the reporters, the stories? Are we still burying stories? What's your perception?
I think that there's a lot of change, obviously, that has happened, and you and I both could have long conversations, you know, from
Yes.
where you sit too, about what has changed and the progress that has been made. I think that we all know that there's a lot that still needs to happen, both in terms of people in the newsrooms, people leading newsrooms, and in terms of coverage. I think, you know, newspapers are doing a better job of being mindful and cognizant of some of these problems and trying to address them. But I think there's no doubt that we need to do more.
We need to do more, and especially I'm looking at your book and I'm knowing that this book needs to be read by everybody when we're going through this swell of banning books. Where does 272 stand in that whole arena, and
Right.
how do we get
Yeah.
beyond that?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, history is a real battleground right now. And we're in a situation where books are being banned, when the teaching and about race and slavery and discrimination, you know, is some people don't want it to happen. This is real. And so I think that when I wrote that first article, this whole issue of slavery and the foundational role it has played felt urgent to me. It feels even more urgent to me now. And quite frankly, the headwinds in many places are blowing against us. At the same time, though, we're also in a moment where there's a lot of reckoning and experimentation. Institutions, not only Georgetown, not only the Catholic Church, Harvard University, a lot of universities, banks, insurance companies, municipalities, right? Evanston, Illinois, the state of California are trying to reckon with this history of slavery and segregation and Jim Crow and find ways to grapple with it right here and right now. So again, we're in a kind of complicated place where we've got these different forces, but you know, I feel like the work is urgent, and I find some hope in the work that's being done around the country on it.
Yeah, there was a little ruffle in the news recently when was it 5 or 6 black women who were running diversity operations in corporations all left, and it was like, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we have, you know, the Supreme Court on affirmative action. We've got a lot of work to do, and politically it is harder to do it. But again, I'm encouraged by the efforts that I'm seeing. When I first wrote that story, I never imagined that there would be institutions talking openly about reparations and about actually doing that. And we're seeing some of that happen.
Well, Rachel Swarns, please keep telling your stories.
Thank you.
You're making a difference for all of us. And in this extremely pivotal opening in history, we need your history and your influence in your daily work in the newspaper. As you know, my friend Gloria Steinem used to say, the reason you need to be in the newspapers is because that's the only way you get into the books.
Right.
So we thank you so much for the work. It's 272, the author, Rachel Swarns. It's the families who were enslaved and sold to build the American Catholic Church. Just think about that. If you haven't picked it up, please do it. It's a must-read. You'll love every page of it. It's a story well told. That's it for us at this time. Thank you for joining us. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. We'll see you the next time.